All right, so I think we're gonna get started. So, hi, my name is Grace Stewart, and I'm a Collections and Exhibitions Manager at the Metal Museum, and I'm going to be moderating this webinar today. So first, I want to thank everyone for joining us from your offices and at home. We hope that we can give you a good webinar. As we do the welcome, I just want to remind you that this is part of our professional development series for the Association of Art Museum Curators. And we organize these set of webinars in order to provide some professional development experience and some expert insight from other colleagues in our field. And we decide on these webinars based on the feedback that we get from you. So if you have any suggestions for us, we of course welcome those suggestions as well. And then just to tell you a little bit about our topic today, hopefully you guys are all familiar with what we'll be talking about, but we are going to be looking at metrics. And so we're looking really at what are metrics and how do they apply to us as museum curators. And then also, what is the kind of data and information that we're gathering? How do we do that? How can we use that information? And then also we're going to talk a little bit about, how we're looking at moving past the numbers and some of the qualitative information we can also be gathering that will help us as curators. And as we go through the webinar, I want to encourage you to submit your questions, and we will try and answer as many of those as we can. We will be keeping all of your questions anonymous, so feel free to ask away, and that information will be kept confidential. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. We have with us Rehan Ansari, who is a partner with OnCue Analytics, and we also have Edward Gargiulo. Did I say it right?
You're good.
Okay, thanks. From MFA Boston, working in membership and database marketing. And so for their full bios, I will refer you back to our website, and you can look there and have a little bit more in-depth information, but I don't want to bog up our time for the webinar today. So I'm going to go ahead and ask each of our panelists to introduce a little bit about how they've worked with, how they're working with metrics, and how that kind of information is applying to what they see happening in the museums. So I'll go ahead and start with Rehan, if you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit of information about your experience.
Sure, thank you. It's good to be at this webinar. I thought that I would start things off by talking about a project that we did with the Rubin Foundation in New York. And what we did was we worked with the foundation on a metrics project, metrics for arts organizations, big and small. So we created workshops for 46 organizations, and several of them we interviewed in depth. And what I'll do is I'll just read off 6 key findings, just to start things off. So we found that organizations are keen to integrate a data-driven approach, but do not have sufficient in-house resources to make this a top priority. Organizations are remarkably open to developing and implementing programmatic measurement systems, including with respect to arts-based programs, once exposed to the idea that metrics can also be qualitative. Finding number 3, organizations are collecting substantial amounts of data, but are not leveraging it to anywhere near its full potential. And 4, thinking specifically about outreach and marketing, organizations are unaware of just how powerful the data they already collect when it comes to powering their efforts in this sphere. 5, often data collected by the organizations live in various databases that have not been centralized. And number 6, and this is one of my favorite findings, most organizations can identify at least one program they consider successful and can easily explain its measurable impact, but they have not taken the steps to do a reverse engineering exercise of a successful program from which a set of metrics might be developed. I just wanted to start off by just talking about these 6 findings, and I'd like to now, turn it back to you to see, um, to see if you have any questions, or if any of these findings could be a starting point for you, Grace.
Yeah, so I think that you talked a little bit about this idea that museums, we often already have a successful project that we can point to. So when you talk about reverse engineering that, like what do you mean by that exactly, and how is that something that we can do?
Well, this really then uh, this question really speaks to our approach, which is customized. We find that in this field, um, the, the the organizations, the activities, the medium of art they're involved in, uh, goals are so diverse that it's difficult to say things across the board. So um, what we did for our workshop was we took specific examples of organizations and worked through them. Um, so the point I'm making is I'm talking about a customized approach.
Okay.
There is no sense of one size fits all here, frankly.
Okay. We have a question from our audience that's asking, when we talk about metrics, what is that information that we're talking about? Are we looking mostly at number of visitors, or what are some of the other things that we're measuring? So, Ed, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you're measuring and how you're working with metrics as well?
Sure. So at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, we obviously look at metrics in a variety of different ways. Where I am most closely involved is in what I like to think of as 3 levels of metrics, and I mostly work in the marketing and communication side, and then also oversee membership. So I have some interest in kind of who's coming to our exhibitions as well. But I think the first one is really in terms of measuring our outbound communications about the exhibitions that we're promoting. So that could be metrics around email engagement, open rates, click-through rates. It could also be things like response to our digital ads for an exhibition, or social engagement with a social campaign. So there are different metrics that we look at across all of those outbound communications in terms of how are the promotions that we're doing for our exhibitions working. And then there are more of what I kind of refer to as the raw data, or the raw numbers. And that might be more kind of the attendance numbers. How many people came into the museum? How many people went into that exhibition? And how many people went to the section on the website for that exhibition? So really just kind of volume in a sense, but not knowing who that person might be or any more about them, just kind of seeing the raw data. And then I think the third level that we really look at has more to do with surveying, which I think can help us provide a little bit more context to some of that raw data. So really specific to exhibitions in my work is about what are really the drivers and influencers that brought them to the museum to see that exhibition. Was it something that we did that was in market that really drove that visit? How did they hear about the exhibition? Why did they decide to come see it? Or potentially why they didn't. We have plenty of visitors who go into our exhibitions and tell us that they didn't even know we had it before they came. So it really helps us understand, when we look at those raw numbers, what's really happening behind the scenes, and it helps us kind of articulate and explain those numbers so that we have a better sense of who our visitors are and where they're coming from. So I think specifically related to exhibitions, I feel like those are the 3 buckets that I'm most closely involved in.
And Rehan, when you're looking at metrics, what kind of information are you pulling?
Well, just to dial it back a bit, let's just say from a 30,000-foot perspective, I just want to also I want to just talk about why measure, a few points.
Okay. Yeah.
So here's some ideas we had. One is and there are 4 points. So one is to focus on outcomes rather than just process. And 2 is determine if a program is actually accomplishing its stated goals. 3, understand which components of a program work and which do not. 4, foster an evidence-based dialogue with funders to allow for a better mutual understanding of needs and expectations. So these are the reasons why we feel you need to measure. And of course, we've come up with this after conversations with many arts organizations. I would also say that some guiding principles around this are that, again, it's worth repeating that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. And each organization's mission is unique, and so is each project. And metrics should always relate back to the organization's core mission. And a singular set of metrics or indicators is just that. A project must be judged in the proper context and not only on the basis of metrics. Metrics are not just a mechanism for accountability, but rather a tool to help put the focus on outcomes. And metrics should be flexible to accommodate evolving goals. What we find with our clients is that, in fact, before we put together a program for them, the key work, the most important work, is in talking to the clients about their goals. So, in fact, most of the work happens up front.
And so when you're talking about outcomes, you're talking about meeting those goals. Could you give us some examples of what you mean when you say outcomes?
Well, again, it depends. It depends. I think when I think Ed was talking about something very specific, for example, when he was talking about how you measure, the way I heard it was how you measure the impact of exhibitions. Mm-hmm. So that's, so that's a specific outcome. I mean, it's broad-based, but it's still something specific. I mean, you could be measuring the impact of a public arts project. You could be measuring the impact of an arts education program. You could be measuring the impact of diversity of audience. You could be measuring sort of the diversity of audience. You could be measuring the impact on a diverse audience. So it depends on your goals. And it depends on, obviously, the organization, the size of organization, its resources, the specific project.
I was just going to add to that. I couldn't agree more. I think it really is specific to what is the goal of what you're trying to achieve. And from my perspective, a lot of the metrics that we look at, as I was saying, like relate to the relative success of an exhibition. So were we successful at communicating awareness and generating interest in the show? But there's a whole other side of the museum that's responsible for evaluating, was the content of the exhibition successful in terms of meeting its goals? If we wanted visitors that came into the exhibition to get this idea or leave with this knowledge, did they impart that? Were we successful in communicating that through the wall text or the interactives or the various mechanisms that we have within the exhibition to communicate those messages, and did those messages resonate? And so I think, again, the goal of what you're trying to do in the circumstances is really important, because you can measure almost anything, but it's to what end? And I think that that's the important question we need to constantly be asking ourselves.
Yeah, that's well said.
And so do either of you have an example of maybe a project that you've worked on and how you decided what your goals were going to be? And what's the process for determining your goals before you even start collecting your data?
I'll give an example I mean, it's still it's a big question, but I'll give an example of well, a specific. Well, we were working with the Sugar Hill Children's Museum, and one of the things that we found the occasion to illustrate to them an important point, which was that if you look at your goals and you look to see whether they are measurable or not. And if they're not measurable, then you look for proxies. Now that I've just said that sounds reasonable, but that took a lot of work to figure out. What is a proxy goal that's measurable? But it's an important concept. It's a key approach, I find. Now I would have to talk about the Sugar Hill Children's Museum and its goals and what were measurable and what were not measurable, and then what were what were proxies that we came up with and they came up with, and then whether those worked or not. So it's a process like that.
I think that it is a process. I mean, we're in the process of completing a strategic plan here at the MFA, and one of the pieces that we went through was developing what are our goals and what are the projects that we want to enact to try and make those goals successful. And as part of that effort, we had to go through the exercise of saying, like, well, what are the outcomes? What are the metrics that we would use to understand if this actual project was successful, and how does that relate back to the goal? And it's certainly not as easy as it sounds. I think people think, oh, well, we can just capture this information or we can look at that data point. And when you get into a dialogue, and I think it's important to do these as a group exercise and to have different perspectives, because it challenges the people in the room to question, well, is that valid? Is that accurate? And I think that those are important questions to ask. I think you can find plenty of things that you can point to and say, well, we can look at the number of visitors that came, and that's a metric for success. But if your goal is diversity, then what does it matter how many people came? It matters what the makeup of those people were. So having that dialogue and really being able to dissect the real goal of what you're trying to do, and then think about those metrics in a thoughtful way to understand, is this really answering that question, or is this an artificial way of measuring success?
Right.
All right, I want to take a step back really quick. Rehan, you mentioned using proxy goals, and could you define a little bit what that is? What is a proxy goal?
Well, it's if you feel you have a goal that you can't measure, then what could be a goal that's kin to that you could measure? And I'll just look for an example of that. For example, again, I have this case study of the Sugar Hill Museum, okay, here's an example. They have a program called Story Time, where they wanted to measure the impact of the storytelling on young adults in the room. But they found that when the young people were telling their stories, they were having a hard time evaluating their own stories. There were exit surveys and interviews, and the kids were not able to talk about how they felt about their stories, or about So they came up with so we suggested a proxy measurement. We suggested that you ask the kids what they thought about another kid's story, and that was a good indicator of attentiveness and reception and so on. So that's an example of a proxy measurement. I've done very little justice to this process. Like I've just had to say it very quickly, but it took some thinking to do this. It's a very dramatic example comes out of campaign politics, which we've been involved in, where to illustrate the idea of proxy measurement, where we wanted to see how a certain community were thought of what they thought of racial profiling, but in the polling, the answers just didn't seem. The surveys just didn't seem to work. So the question we asked then was, do you think your neighbor is racist? And then suddenly we had all these answers. So that's an example of proxy measurement.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for those examples. One of the other things that we hear a lot is this idea of quantitative versus qualitative data, and that sometimes they're set up to be in opposition, or that one might be better than the other. Could you both talk a little bit about how you use both quantitative and qualitative data, maybe when you use it and how you collect that different kind of data?
Well, an important thing to say is that metrics is not an enemy of the qualitative. There's no. A lot of people have this sense that, they feel discouraged somehow right at the onset of an exercise that's about measurement of impact, by feeling that it'll have to involve data, or it'll have to involve numbers, but that's just not true for us, or really it's just not a good approach. So one of the things that we do when we are going through a metrics exercise with a client is we come up with a qualitative and a quantitative bucket. Like let's look at your goals, and then just put them into this one bucket or the other, and then deal with that. Qualitative, as Ed has mentioned, can be there can be so many ways to capture that, and obviously that's not numbers, and that's a perfectly reasonable approach for certain projects. Again, we have to be now specific about what project we are talking about before I can say anything about whether a mostly qualitative program would be better or a quantitative. Usually, it's a mix of both.
I was just gonna. I agree. I think it's a mix of both, at least in my experience. I think that we really use both successfully together. I think when you use any one individually, you're only really seeing half of the solution. And so to really get the full and complete picture, you really need to see both. The numbers can tell you so much, but the granularity that you get with the more qualitative is invaluable in a way, because it really helps you get a window into what's really happening underneath the surface. So we found great success leveraging both, but I think, again, you really need to start with what are we trying to do, what are we trying to achieve, and then that a lot of times leads to the design of how you use both of them. And so, using the exhibition example I kind of cited earlier, I think is one way that we use both. So we look at the raw numbers in terms of who's coming in and who's going into the show, so that we can see those total numbers, but then we'll do surveying to understand why did they go into that show, what drove them to go into that show. And some of that is still quantitative because it's raw numbers, how many came for this and how many came for that. But then we'll get to qualitative, where we ask for verbatims around, well, if you just randomly decided to go into the exhibition during your visit, what prompted you to go into that exhibition and that show? And I think it can also help, because what you can pick up sometimes in those instances are reasons and rationales that aren't immediately apparent, and they can help inform either ongoing strategy for that specific exhibition or future exhibitions. Because a lot of times people are responding to something that you might not even be aware of. So that's just another example of where that qualitative can really add a lot of value that the numbers might just mask.
And then how are you collecting that qualitative data? Are you mostly using surveys? Are there any other methods that we could be looking to use?
In my work, I would just say we've definitely used surveys, but we've also done focus groups, in-depth interviews with people. So there's a variety of ways that we've done it at the museum.
Maybe I'll ask, if I may, I'd like to ask Ed a question just to
Sure.
maybe illustrate one of these points. I wanted to ask you about, say, say a quantitative metric or metrics that you felt so quantitative, but you felt did not lend themselves to a reliable measurement. If you had an example of that. So you came up with one, but then you thought, oh, that didn't work, and so you thought of another one. If you can remember.
I'm trying to think of. So it's a quantitative measurement that didn't. I mean, I think we come up with them all the time.
Exactly.
I can give you a couple of theoretical ones that happened in a discussion we had recently.
Mm-hmm.
One of them related to how we would measure the impact of an acquisition. So if we acquired this work of art, how would we measure, whether that successfully drove audience? And someone said, well, why couldn't we just measure the number of people that go and look at that object? And my response was, well, that's not really an accurate measurement, because they could have just been at the museum that day. Us acquiring that object didn't result in them coming to the museum to see that object.
Right.
We would need to ask a follow-up question or something along those lines. So I think all the time there are constantly ideas about how to get at something, and I think this is where the discussion is really important. And I think sometimes you can find quantitative metrics that you would never even imagine. And another discussion we had internally was one about how could we measure the relevancy of our exhibitions. So the goal is obviously to do exhibitions that are relevant to people today. So how would we be able to understand if that were true? And one of the ideas that came up was looking at the press that's written about our shows and where that press appears. So is it constantly in the art section where they're just writing about exhibitions and that's the latest one we have open? Or is it in the ideas section because it relates to something that's going on in the greater world, or another section of the paper, or a different paper or magazine picked up that story because of that? So I think you can look at some things like the number of press mentions that a show gets and where they get mentioned as a metric that is, in a lot of ways, it is quantitative, but you would never imagine, oh, that's something that we would look at to identify the relevancy of an exhibition. But done right, it potentially could be.
Yeah, I can also. I'd also.
Question.
No, you did. In fact, it got me thinking about how an example of how we looked at some proposed metrics and assessed the viability of each. And I'll just give an example of say two that the organization proposed and then we disqualified. We were critical of. So the museum thought that this would be a good quantitative metric, whether adults will revisit or discuss the storytelling program, the stories in the storytelling program at the museum after leaving the museum. I hope that was clear. That when they go home, whether the adults will discuss it with their children. And we thought that there's a problem with this proposed quantitative measure because it will rely on on a self-reporting intent, which we find inherently unreliable. So that's an example of a metric. And a related metric was whether adults will say that they plan to return with their children for another story time at the museum. And we think that that was also a problem. That metric also had a problem because of the same reason. It relies too much on self-reporting intent. So.
Yeah, and I would just say that we've had the same experience. The mantra that we constantly say is people are poor predictors of their future behavior. And I think that we've had that problem where we've tried to say, with some of our exhibition surveying, how likely would you be to come to this exhibition if we were to mount it at some point in the future? And what we saw was really inconsistent results with what that survey data told us and then what we actually saw in actuality. And I think it's for the very reasons that you state. They're just, people don't, either they're very optimistic and they like to think that they would go to it, and so they like to presume, oh, of course I would come to that. But their behavior doesn't really match what they, in an ideal world, I think would like to do. So it becomes really important to understand like what you can rely on and what you can't rely on.
So what we did, if I may just continue, what we did was we replaced these two metrics with these suggestions. So instead of this one where you measure whether adults will revisit the museum or discuss the story with their children, we revised it into what values, lessons the adults thought children should take away from story time. We think that would be a better question to have on a survey or in an in-depth interview. So I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah, I think that made sense. We've got a couple questions coming in, and one of them asks if you've ever run into any ethical or legal issues surrounding collecting any kind of sensitive demographic information, and how do you deal with that maybe up front or make people more comfortable in responding? Have either of you had to deal with that in any capacity?
Not really.
No.
Because people are asked.
Sorry, go ahead.
People are asked their permission, and they fill in forms or they answer questions about where they are or where they live and so on. So you collect that information. That often it's information of members or people who are coming in through the door. Or
I was just going to add that people always have the right to not participate or to refuse. So if they don't feel comfortable sharing, they typically won't participate. So it hasn't been an issue for us.
And when you're collecting data, do you have any suggestions for our audience on how to diversify who is participating? Because as you said, if people don't feel comfortable participating, they kind of self-select. So what can you do to try and encourage more participation so you're not seeing just the same people who enjoy doing the surveys?
Well, that's a very big question. I mean, that's the holy grail, really, for a lot of our organizations. Maybe for all of them. So I would like to ask about a specific program, for instance, that this organization is looking to have a diverse audience for. And since I'm also an artist, I also like to think up the line in terms of, well, when you conceive of a program, you should be thinking about the audience. Too many times I encounter a situation where there's already programming, and then the question around diversity starts coming up as a goal. But I would like to. I would like these ideas to be right up, to be there at inception, frankly. But that's a very big. That's a whole. That's more than a webinar. That's a lot of thinking and talk.
And Ed, have you seen any incentives that have helped, get people to respond or participate in surveys or that kind of data gathering?
I mean, I think as far as data gathering itself and diversifying and collecting information, I think that there's a couple of things that we always, as an organization, we always try to employ. And I think one is that we always try to do on-site interviews, on-site intercepts whenever possible, because if we're certainly trying to survey our current audience or museum goers, that's something where it's not self-selective. You don't know who's replying to a web survey, so you can track the number of refusals that you get. You can position yourself in a place where you can ask every 5th person or every 10th person or whatever it is to really try and create a random sample of who you're asking and who you're selecting. It also becomes important to make sure that you're doing it in terms of diversity of day, time of day of week. So it's really, and some of this goes back to what are you trying to do and who are you trying to survey. So if you're trying to survey people who attend a specific program, then you can kind of do it all at once and in that moment. If you're trying to survey general museum visitors or general visitors to your museum, you need to be cognizant of the fact that if you only sample, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday from 10 a.m. to noon, you're going to get a very different group than you might see on the weekend. So just really kind of thinking through holistically what are the times of day, the days of week that you're doing it. And then in terms of if you are getting a high number of refusals, I think that you need to be looking at things like survey length. So how long is it? What are the types of questions that you're asking? Are people dropping off after a certain point? I think we've generally found that if you can keep it short and sweet and to the point, you get a higher level of participation and letting people know, oh, will you be, can you help us? It's a 5-question survey, or it takes about 3 minutes. I think are ways that we kind of certainly try and stimulate uptick. And then the last is just to do some type of incentive, even if it's something small. So whether it's a discount at the shop or a dining venue or a pass for free parking or a pass to come again to the museum some other time for free, something that's basically just a recognition of the time. And from our perspective, I think that the incentive really becomes a little bit of a continuum with the level of effort you're asking them to put into it. So for example, we just did this one on-site intercept survey, and it was an exercise that we were asking them to complete, and it took about 20 to 30 minutes. So we actually gave them a $25 gift card that could be used anywhere to the museum because we were asking them to make a relatively substantial commitment of time. So that's obviously very different than something that's a 5-question, takes a minute or 2 to complete.
And so as you're collecting this data, one of the things that we hear a lot too is that for small institutions, this seems like a huge undertaking. So if we don't have access to, the stellar marketing department, or, we can't afford to hire a consultant, what are some of the things that smaller institutions can start to do as far as, dealing with metrics? And is this getting volunteers? Are there any resources you could point to, or any suggestions you have for some of our smaller institutions?
Well, I think it's not. I think it's. This point has come out several times now in this discussion that it's not a question. It's not simply a question of collecting data or having large amounts of it, and it's more about a way of thinking, which does take getting used to. So that's the challenge. We find that a lot of arts organizations, smaller ones, are just too busy doing what they do. So to get staff that are already working very hard to think differently is a challenge. It's like wearing a different hat, so to speak, and. So that I find is the challenge. It's not about it's not it's not about data, let's say. It's a way of thinking that has to be gotten used to. So
I was going to say this question reminds me of the I think the 6 points that Rehan started with in terms of a lot of organizations have a lot of data, a lot of it's in different silos or different departments, and it's not that they lack the interest, it's that they lack the staff to really make use of it.
that's right.
And I think that, what I would say to the smaller organization is start by looking at what you have, because to those very points, a lot of places already have a lot of information at their disposal. They might just not know about it.
That's right.
So talking with people in different areas of the organization, what type of information are we collecting? When we do ticketing, how do we ticket? How is that information kept? Who knows about that information? But I think there's probably more there than people are even aware of. And
Yes.
I think that's always a great place to start, by trying to break down some of those silos and some of those barriers and really working across the organization to start to get a sense of why are we collecting this in this way? What can we do with it? And if we want to do something different, how can we potentially make that change so that we can use that information that we're already gathering in a way that's more conducive to the goals of the organization?
And have you seen success with having volunteers help with some of those processes? As far as some of that, I mean, you talked about, being too busy and being able to gather data or being able to look at it. I mean, and if you have used volunteers, like what kind of training do you think that volunteers need to be able to effectively help institutions?
Well, I don't know about volunteers, but we have seen the impact of arts organizations getting some training around metrics, exposing staff to certain concepts, and then seeing where they are the next year. You can also see it in the way that they're writing grants differently. So the stuff around self-analysis is more tight, let's say. You can see that they gain the perspective and then develop experience around this stuff. So yes, you see an impact, but I think we're talking about staff here. I'm not sure about if I've ever seen a program that's around volunteers coming in and making an impact, say. It will have to be decision makers within the organization who start looking at things this way. So.
Yeah, in my experience, I would agree. I think it has to be the decision makers and the staff within the organization that really need to lead the effort. The one exception I can say where we have used volunteers is when we're doing something like fielding a survey, where once we've created it and we know what it is, with minimal training on randomization of samples and who they're asking, that's where we've kind of employed volunteers to help support that effort. But that, I think, is the only example I can think of.
Okay, we just got another question in that says, okay, so you've collected your data, whoever's collecting it has, looked at it, they've analyzed it. What is some suggestions on getting that information out there? So now that you have some information and some answers to your questions, what's the best way to share that without necessarily putting out a 40-page report that every department head doesn't necessarily have time to read? Do you have any suggestions of what you do now that you've collected this information?
Well, it shouldn't be a 40-pager.
I was going to say the same thing.
It just shouldn't be a 40-pager. I think the whole point should be, well, we really stress the practical, as opposed to like getting into endless debates around qualitative and quantitative and the meaning of art, or which is a way to go, but we really stress the practical. So it has to be look, we were measuring this, we should instead measure that. These were the kind of survey questions we had, but it should be this set. So practicality is important to us. But if you do a literature survey, that's not true for everybody. There's a lot of debate, important, but we stress practicality, and so no 40 pages.
And the only thing I would add, because I completely agree, keep it practical and keep it simple, but I think it's to start small and start easy. And to that very point, like this shouldn't be something that you're disseminating to everyone else. It's something that should grow organically based on some of these discussions. So if you start by involving the right people with what are the goals, what are we trying to do, how are we going to measure it, then people should be receptive and want to kind of see that information. And if you can keep it to a simple, a few simple key performance indicators or KPIs, then people don't need to read a 40-page study to kind of understand what's happening, and they're somewhat invested in the process because they ideally were at least aware of or even part of the discussion that went into why we're measuring this and what we hope to do with it. And the other piece that I would say is that what I found here at the museum is that a little data goes a long way, and that once you start sharing information and once people start like leaning on those numbers and coming to rely on like, well, what is this number and what does that mean? Questions will beget questions, and that's where you'll start to get more sophisticated and where people will have an interest because you've kind of led that horse to water and you've started really simple with something they could grasp and understand. And as they get more comfortable with that, they'll want to become more sophisticated because they'll start asking more sophisticated questions.
There might be another reason for this question. I mean, I'm just going off perhaps on a tangent here, but there might be some initial attention in an executive director's mind around writing, around doing a self-assessment versus writing a grant. So I would say that foundations these days would appreciate a genuine attempt at self-assessment, at metrics. I'm finding more and more that people are fine looking at something where where an arts organization is saying we would like to meet this objective, we tried these 5 things, and we got somewhere close. And here's where we think here's what we think could be next steps in measuring how far we are from our goal. Now, the divergence from the goal might be large, but the organization's journey shows significant work, and it makes a good impact on a foundation. So I think if there's a nervousness around, say, self-assessment and using it candidly in a proposal, perhaps one could think about it. One could think about the fact whether that's really a valid anxiety, let's say.
We had another question, and this one is geared a little bit more towards you, Ed, about how curators sometimes feel frustrated when they approach a marketing department and with an exhibition idea, and they're told, oh, well, that's not going to get enough press, or that's not going to bring in visitors. What's some language that curators can use, or what's a way to approach that where they can maybe start looking at how can they use data to help make arguments for those kind of exhibitions, or start that conversation? If you have any insight on that.
I would say what I have advocated for at the museum is more research around the vetting of exhibition ideas with market research. So how can we, so it doesn't become basically a battle of opinion or a battle of will, but it becomes a battle of fact and what we've actually gone out there to find. And so what we're actually in the process of working on right now is what would that look like here at the museum. So Would that be, market research, and would that be through surveying? How would we survey? Again, knowing that people are poor predictors of their future behavior, like what are the types of questions that we would want to ask to really gauge someone's interest or awareness, or whether or not something was an idea that was one that we wanted to explore. And I think even more importantly for us, it's about, we're always looking for the right exhibition mix. So not every exhibition that we do has the goal of bringing in X many visitors. There are some exhibitions that we do because they strengthen relationships with different communities. There are other exhibitions that we do because they advance scholarship. So one of the goals that we as an institution have is to make sure that we have the right mix of those exhibitions happening at the same time, so that we have something that's going to draw in the more populous crowd, let's say. We have another one that's going to be of interest to the more engaged art circle. And so where I think research can help is not necessarily with the discussion about saying yes or no, but saying when and paired with what, so that we have the right mix over the course of months or years. So hopefully that wasn't too much of a cop-out, but that's how I think we approach it here at the museum.
Right. Thank you. One of the other things that we've talked about a little bit is the idea that metrics and measuring in museums is still a relatively new field. It's not, so it's still evolving and people are still figuring out how this works, and therefore they shouldn't be so intimidated by it. It's okay to kind of just get started, maybe not if you don't feel like an expert. But could either of you talk a little bit about how you've seen metrics in museums kind of evolve and change since you've been working on them, and maybe where you hope that they would go, and maybe some things you hope we are able to start measuring?
Well, I would just say right away that it definitely is a new subject, and growing interest. So people shouldn't get. People should understand. I would say arts organizations, curators should not be too worried about getting it right. They should just start the process. It's an evolving field. If you do a literature survey, you will see that everybody is grappling with stuff. It's not. There's not a lot of consensus, I would say, on many things. So it's also an opportunity to come up with, say, new ways of thinking about things. I think Ed gave certain really great examples of coming up with new concepts for in terms of like what to measure. So it can be exciting for that reason, rather than be intimidating. Okay, so there's no consensus. There's lots of people saying different things. Well, then they are, we feel that if you decide that it's a process, you will make some headway, and you can you can encourage a spirit of innovation. Yeah. So that's what I would say. Rather than feeling a sense of feeling lost, or like there are just too many experts, say, or too many debates.
And then, Ed, have you seen any shifts in how you're measuring or how metrics are being used or applied? And
I mean, I definitely think that it is an evolution, and I look at what we were doing, 5-10 years ago, and it pales in comparison to what we're doing today. And the comment I made earlier about, if you start, even if you start small, you'll see it really start to grow rapidly. I use that as my own experience, because I think we did start very small. We started with just really simple metrics like how many people are coming through the door. Then we started saying how many people are going to these exhibitions. And what you kind of learn is, people start asking more and more sophisticated questions, because you all of a sudden have an exhibition where you're saying, why, why did this exhibition get 200 and something thousand people when this exhibition in the same space during the same time only got half that? The marketing budgets were the same, overall visitation during that period was the same, and so the questions beget other questions, and that's really what leads, I think, to sophistication and evolution, because you're constantly being challenged with that next question from whoever, whether it's a curator, the director, a department head, and you have to find ways to answer that question. And I think that's where the innovation comes in, and the ideas of what is a way that we can get at this, or what's a proxy for that. And so if you start even small, I think you will start to see it grow, and it is an evolving field. There is no right or wrong answer. And so I think that people are approaching it differently, and I think that's great, because you get to see what other people are doing, and would that work for me, or do we need something that's going to be more unique to our environment or our goals? And I think we can all learn from each other. The one great thing I'm constantly reminded of working in an arts organization is that we don't really view each other as competition. We view each other as colleagues. And so I think there is a great spirit of collaboration within the arts market and environment, where we're all very open and willing to share our information. And so take advantage of that. Go visit and speak with colleagues, ask them what they're doing, and see what you can learn from them, because I think everyone's really open to doing that, and I think it's a great way to figure out what could work for you.
Also, just speaking a little bit to somewhat to Ed's point, I would say that, look, a metrics exercise we find has been almost universally good for an organization in clarifying its goals. So, I mean, like say, I would say dozens of arts organizations that we have talked to have unanimously said this. And I would just say it's kind of self-evident. Like if I just look at some of the steps we have written out for when we start a metrics exercise, like step 1 is understanding and defining your goals. Step 2 is distill and enumerate your goals in a brief, straightforward format. I mean, this is an exercise it's bound to benefit an organization. Clarify goals with as much specificity as possible. Define what success or progress means in the context of your goals. So, you keep hitting this idea of what are your goals, and what is your progress, and how specific can you be? Have you been specific enough? So right at the top of a metrics program, you have this exercise, which I think it's self-evident that it will benefit an arts organization.
Yeah, and I mean, I would just say that it goes back to that idea that no one should be tracking metrics for metrics' sake, or collecting data for data's sake. I mean, one of the things that we constantly ask ourselves when we're developing something or trying to figure something out is, how is this going to be used? What's going to be done with it? And if we can't answer that in a really clear-cut way, or relate it to one of the goals that we're trying to achieve, then we very quickly kind of throw it in the basket, because it becomes not worth our time or effort. And I think that it's important to stop asking if you can, but really ask if you should, because I think that will help organizations prioritize what matters and what doesn't.
Great, and then we have just a few minutes left, so I just wanted to finish up with some questions around, as we start looking at some of our exhibitions are starting to take on more of a social impact goal, and so when we have goals that have to do with measuring things that are intrinsic benefits, or what we consider intangible benefits, have you seen any success as you are working through this, and how you're getting at some of those questions? So if the impact is to create more empathy, or these kind of like larger questions that we're hoping that our exhibitions are also bringing to people, are there any ways in which you've seen that start to happen as well?
Well, we have been working with organizations that have an explicit goal around arts and social justice. So this is this is the mandate. But again, it varies according to their program. Is it public art? Is it exhibitions? Like at the museum, it works for. Is it an arts education program? So it again depends on the program, but the questions that they need answered are exactly of this kind, because they're around social justice.
This is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but I think it most closely correlates with what I was mentioning earlier about there's another level of metrics in the museum that are about the success of our exhibitions. And what we do for those is a lot of the times we'll do exit surveys or people are leaving, and there's a survey set that we'll ask. And I think this is a great example of you can't really ask people if they feel more empathy having seen it, but it's probably one of those examples where you could come up with proxy questions to get at that. Right. So I think again it would be really specific to what are the goals of that show or that exhibition. Right. But I think an exit survey could be a way to try and get at the level of success. I think the questions that you ask would become of critical importance, though. Right.
And just to add to that, we talk about surveys and exit surveys and questions to be asked. Now there's a lot of skill involved in asking the right questions. It's very easy to say that we have to have a survey or an exit survey, and I don't mean to I'm not belittling that. I'm just saying that it takes a lot more thinking than the word suggests. Let's say, people think anything, frankly, can be a survey, but it's not. You have to ask the right questions. It has to lead to the right measurement. So you do need expertise for this.
I couldn't agree more. I was just going to say the one thing where I definitely feel like we've engaged consultants and professional support is around survey design.
Right.
The fact of how you ask a question, what possible answers you give people, how you ask multiple questions to try and get at the same idea to validate. These are things that it's a professional skill set, and it's not something that you can certainly go out there and ask a survey with questions. But I would definitely advocate for seeking professional assistance with that, because I think how you ask it and the manner in which you do it is really critical to getting the right information. And if you don't do it correctly, then you can't really rely on that data. So it's almost like the old adage of garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have the right questions and the right survey, then you're not really going to be able to take action on that. So I couldn't agree more and advocate that people should seek professional assistance, especially in the beginning, and especially if they're starting to get into really complicated things, like not just the demographics of their visitors, but did they leave this exhibition, and if we're trying to impact their empathy, that's a really challenging question to get at, and I certainly would think that we would leverage some outside expertise to help us figure out how to do that.
And I'd just like to add, so a survey is and I often like to use the word survey instrument instead of just using the word survey. It is a very specific instrument, and it has to be designed as one. I think the word survey is too well used in the language to show the use of it in these specific ways for our purposes.
And so for people who are wanting to start doing surveys and maybe they don't have the money right now to hire a consultant, are there any examples or places that they could go to maybe see what other people have done and have worked well that they could use as models if they have similar kind of questions that they're asking?
Well, you can ask around, but frankly, I would trust people. If I don't have resources, I would certainly trust somebody who's had a lot of experience writing surveys. You can't do without that experience. As Ed says, you'll ask a question which answers are going to be worthless, frankly.
The other suggestion that I would make, and it might just be because I'm in Boston and we have a plethora of universities and colleges around, but there are a lot of higher education facilities that have classes on stats and statistics and market research, and so going and working with some of those professors and asking if they might have students that are interested, or even if they have practicum work that they need to do, that can be another way of getting expertise, but at no cost. So that's something else that I think people could try and take advantage of.
Sure. Although this field of arts organizations and say social justice makes things, it requires, it's almost a different wheelhouse, is my opinion. I think I don't think you can just go to a stats class of sociologists, frankly, for these purposes.
Yeah, I mean, I think with anything, it really, as we kind of said, every example is kind of specific, and without getting into the detail of exactly what are you trying to get at and what's the goal you're trying to solve, it's hard to kind of craft a one-size-fits-all answer. So again, depending on the level of sophistication, I completely agree.
Well, thank you. I think that definitely gives people some ideas of how to approach things. As we're getting ready to wrap up, are there any final thoughts you have? Maybe something I didn't ask that you want to make sure you share with the audience, or something you want them to think about as we're closing?
I think I just recap some of the things that we maybe mentioned initially, which is that some of these concepts take a while to sink in. I mean, it's easy enough to say there's qualitative and quantitative, but and it might seem you may go, well, what's next? What's the next thing? What's the next thing after that? Let's look at data and let's look at. But I think if one needs to just sit with just that, for example, like what's qualitative in what you're doing, and what do you think is quantitative in terms of how you would think about measuring it. That in itself is it's such a key exercise, and it takes time to learn to think like that. So I would say, I don't know, just like it's important to just sit with some of the concepts right at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I view it as it's an iterative process, and you learn as you go, and you get more sophisticated, and just to view it as a journey, because I think for me, at least personally, that's really what it's been. And as you continue along it, you'll evolve and you'll grow and you'll learn more, but just to keep with it, and you'll get to where you want to be.
Well, thank you both for participating in our webinar as panelists and sharing all of your wealth of knowledge with us. And then for the viewers that are participating in our audience, this webinar will be available online in about a week on the website, and we'll also be posting some other resources that we have to go along with this, so some other readings and things that you can peruse, and hopefully that will help you as well. So, all right, I think that's it for today, and thank you again for spending your time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.